welcome to my short video on how to properly recover, vacuum, and recharge a Hool Motorcoach. To correctly perform this work, you're going to need a recovery machine, a vacuum gauge, hoses and adapters, manifold gauge, and a vacuum pump. The particular machine we're going to be using in this video is a Robinair 34888HD heavy-duty machine, and we'll go over some of the controls and how to properly use the machine for this type of work. This is not the only machine you can use, but this is the one used in this video. This is the Elitech VGW Mini Wireless Digital Vacuum Gauge that we'll also be using. In order to make the vacuum process go a lot faster, we're going to be using a Yellow Jacket Super Evac pump, which is a two-stage pump and is much more effective than the machine that's built into the Robinair recovery machine. There are also various different hoses and fittings depending on the type of setup you have on the side of your vehicle. As you can see in this image here, this is the setup I'm using to vacuum out the vehicle using that larger vacuum pump. And we'll explain a little later in the video what some of those setups do and why I'm using those particular setups for this. So when it comes to properly working on an air conditioning system this size, I have an overview here of the layout of where the components are inside the vehicle, and the condenser and the Bitzer compressor in particular. The condenser is usually located in the middle of the vehicle on the driver's side, and the Bitzer compressor is located at the rear of the vehicle on the passenger side. And something that is really important to explain, in order to properly work on the system, you need to do most of the service from the condenser assembly on the side of the vehicle. So a lot of folks do work at the rear on the compressor itself. They do all the vacuuming from there, and they recover, and then they refill from there. But the problem is the machines are really designed to put liquid back into the vehicle when you do that, and you can damage the compressor when you work back there using the machine. The other problem is it takes a lot longer to service the machine from the back of the vehicle at the compressor, because you're pulling Freon through check valves and expansion valves, and you're not recovering the liquid right at the receiver tank, which we'll show and talk about. So here we are at the side of the receiver tank. You can see the tank is the larger black tank on the right hand side, and I have our recovery machine is hooked up to the ports on the top of the valve on the filter dryer and the bottom port of the filter dryer. And one thing about the bottom port here in the filter dryer is I actually had to use an adapter to convert from a normal flared fitting to the correct fitting for the recovery machine to clip on. So you'll need an adapter in order to do that. I'll try to include a link to an adapter in this video so that you can properly connect as well. Some buses don't have a flared port at that location on the pipe. In that case, you'll have to hook up your machine to the king valve at the very bottom, but that will limit some of your ability to refill the machine easily. The reason this bottom port is a problem, and you can't really tell in this picture because I actually swapped out the bottom service port for a low side port to fit my adapter onto, is that the bottom port is a high side port, and the AC service machine only has a low and low side and one high side. So you can only hook up to the high side port at the top or the bottom with the AC service machine, unless of course you swap the ports out, which most people won't do or have the ability to do. Like I said earlier, recovering the system from the back of the coach is really not a good practice at all, recovering or refilling from the back of the coach. However, if you have the necessary and extra equipment, you can connect to the back of the coach on the service ports on the compressor and use those connections to hook up to an additional vacuum pump and vacuum the system from the rear while also vacuuming out from the middle. And that'll help speed up the recovery or the vacuum process and vacuum time. Before we get into actually servicing the equipment, first thing we should talk about is the service valves themselves that we work with. The service valves have a cover, which is number 3 in the image, that you remove, and then you're going to use a tool to turn the stem, number 4, clockwise or counterclockwise. And that stem will push this piston, which you can see number 6 in the video, either all the way forward and close off the flow of Freon that's going through 7. You can see 7, actually there's an inlet and an outlet. And then if you back the stem all the way out, it will close off the service port, which is number 1. And if you put the stem in the middle, anywhere in the middle, you'll actually be able to use the service equipment on the service port while also allowing the Freon to flow through the system. So that's a mid-seated position, and that allows us to service the system while also allowing it to run. It's very important at the end of all the services when you're done is that you backseat, which is turn the stem counterclockwise, and backseat the valve so that the system is fully functional and there's no restrictions inside the system. So I realized while making the video that I did record the recovery process using the AC machine. However, that's a small portion of the project, and most people know how to do that anyways using the recovery machine. So what we will discuss, though, is how to vacuum and use the vacuum gauge to vacuum the system out. After replacing the filter dryer, it's always good to vacuum out the small section of the system with just a filter dryer. Then when we know everything is working correctly and the vacuum levels can be achieved with the pump, we'll open up the whole system and we will vacuum out the entire system before eventually recharging it with Freon. So the following few videos I recorded on the coach, so they're going to be a little bit louder and the audio quality may not be as great, but hopefully you'll be able to pick up the important aspects of what we're doing. And if there's any areas where I should point out any notes, I will put them on the screen. 230. So everything's sealed. It should get down below 1,000, usually down to like 600. It's 500 to 600. I don't know if we're going to get quite that low with this vacuum pump. It's got a little life on it, but as long as we get under 1,000, that's always a good sign. It shows here the temperature, 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the boiling point of water right now at that vacuum level. So there's no issue that we didn't get it low enough to pull the water out. And once we know that this side of the system works, then we can go ahead and open up the valves and pull the rest of the bus down, because at least we know that the gauge is correct and that's all working. We're going to hook up the bigger hose and do it with the bigger hose. So this setup I have here is a little contraption, I guess that you can call it, that I have configured in order to allow me to use the larger 3/8 vacuum hose with the 3/8 port on the vacuum pump. And in this configuration, I was able to attach my service ports to the high and to the low side, or actually both high ports, or if I wanted to swap out the bottom port here on the left side, I could switch it to a low side port. And I'll be able to use the full capacity of the vacuum pump that you're going to see, the Robin Air vacuum pump, to vacuum the system out much faster and also achieve a deeper level of vacuum that I'm looking for. Of course, if all you have is the AC service machine and a high side connection, you can do the vacuuming with just the high side connection, and typically I do it at the top port, as you can see in this image here. That's also okay, it will just take longer. So here I have my setup to the 3/8 hose going to a larger vacuum pump, much larger than the one that's inside the recovery machine. With this particular setup, I am attached to the service port at the bottom and the service port above the filter dryer. You can see I'm at 13,000 microns and about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a boiling point of water, as you can see on this gauge. So the exterior temperature is 76, so I should be evacuating any moisture that's in the system using this method. The other nice feature about this setup is that I can turn off individual valves for the top or the bottom port, and if I turn the two off, I can confirm that my vacuum is either staying steady or raising. And if the vacuum starts to go up with the ports turned off, then I know I most likely have a leak in the system. So as you can see, it's holding steady at 13,000 microns, which means likely there's no leak in the system. And I'm able to open these back up again and continue recovering the rest of the air conditioning system using this method. So in order to speed the process up a little bit, I also have a set of vacuum gauges, or I also have a set of gauges at the compressor, and both valves open, and I have a smaller vacuum pump. So you can see I have the valve installed on the low side port here at the back. It's a little hard to see on this setup, and then also on the high side port. And these valves are mid-seated, just like the valves at the side of the bus.
A few moments later, 2,000 years later, one eternity later.
So So here you can see we've reached 750 microns. That's about what this vacuum pump can do. Even on a test bench, which is always good to test your equipment before you use it. I'm not going to get much lower than this on the bus, but I'm below 1,000 microns, which is more than acceptable. And I know everything's been evacuated properly and there are no leaks. So now I can shut off the valves and see if the vacuum level starts to increase. Just want to briefly show you at the back where the vacuum is also reading correctly on the gauge, although these manifold gauges are not very accurate, but it does show that there is a vacuum here at the back of the compressor as well. And after going back and checking again with the valves turned off, you can see that the vacuum level has not risen, which tells me I have a tight and dry system, and everything is ready for us to continue to fill the system back up with Freon. So earlier I showed you just vacuuming out the filter dryer, which is always important when you replace just a filter dryer. And in this small video, you can see how I have this set up with the service valves here. The bottom service valve is front seated all the way in, so it's closed off the bottom port, and the top service valve is also front seated all the way in, and then I just have a vacuum line going to the recovery machine. But the interesting thing you'll notice is it's vacuuming right now, and you see the gauge reads 30 inches of mercury, and that's really not possible because, as you may have noticed on the vacuum gauge itself, we're only at 4,200 microns. So even though it looks vacuumed out correctly, it still hasn't achieved the level it needs to be. So now that the system's been vacuumed out all the way, we're going to refill it right from the bottle itself. We're going to use a scale and zero out the scale with our bottle on it. And we're really going to use just a high side service line. It's attached to the bottle, and then I attach that service line to the bottom port on the filter dryer here, as you can see. So after purging the line and zeroing out the scale, I now have the configuration set up to fill the coach. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to open up the valve on top of the tank all the way now. And right now there's vapor coming out of the tank going into the bus because it's right side up. But if I flip it upside down like this and lay it on top of the scale, it will start to fill with liquid. And it will start to fill very quickly, so it's really important to watch the scale. So here's a close-up of the scale right now, and you can see in just a few moments that it's actually already put 1.3 pounds in, and it's going up quite fast. So it's really important to watch and monitor this process while it's happening, so this way you don't overfill by accident, which would be difficult with a bottle this small, but it can happen with a larger bottle. And also to make sure nothing's freezing up while you're filling the coach. And we're going to be looking for the scale to eventually stop moving, so we'll know we're done with this bottle. Inside the coach, you can go through the dash display, and this is a newer dash display, but you can go through the dash display to the service menu for the air conditioning system, and you can use the service menu to manually open up the liquid solenoid valves and just help make sure that everything is wide open when you're filling the coach up with Freon. And sometimes that will help go a little bit faster. On a hot day like today in Florida, it's not as big a deal, but it really doesn't hurt. You can hear the fans, the AC fans running in cooling charge override with all the valves open. So it's really important that when you do this mode, that you ensure that you have a battery charger on the coach, and that the compressor clutch is unplugged so that it's not activated while this is happening. So you can see already there's about almost 7 pounds of Freon inside the coach right now. So I'm going to go ahead and shut off the cooling charge override and let it continue filling on its own. What you'll notice eventually will happen is that the scale will stop moving. All the Freon's not going to make it out of the bottle to get into the bus at this stage because you already have a bunch of Freon now stored inside the receiver and the filter dryer and some of the condenser itself. So at this stage, we're going to have to do a little trick that will allow us to essentially pull the remaining Freon out of the bottle, or at least pull out the amount that we need. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is actually start the coach up because there's enough Freon inside of it right now for it to run the air conditioning system. So I'll start the coach up, and then the next step is to front seat this lower king valve on the bottom of the receiver tank itself and move my service port up to the top king valve. What that's going to do is it's going to force the compressor on the bus to pull Freon out of the bottle instead of out of the receiver tank that's already on the bus. Because remember, with the valve front seated, I've closed off the flow of Freon. So with that happening, now we'll look at the scale, and you'll start to notice once the compressor engages on the bus that the scale starts to move again and starts pulling out the remaining Freon out of the tank. And I'd actually noticed myself when I was looking at the scale that nothing was coming out of the tank, so I realized that I forgot to mid-seat the top valve, which I'm doing right now, and you can start to see the numbers on the scale. They're actually decreasing because Freon's coming out of the bottles. Now that we know everything's working correctly, we'll flip the bottle back over again because I need Freon to go in a little bit faster than it is right now. And so in doing so, you can see the numbers will go a lot faster. So it's already going up 0.1 pounds probably every couple seconds compared to the vapor stage that we were using just a few moments earlier. So you can see here that I'm up to about 14.7 pounds of Freon. I'm pretty close to where I want to be for what I need to take out of the tank. And the reason I'm not putting all of the Freon from the tank into the bus is because I also already have a bunch of Freon inside the recovery machine that came out of this coach originally. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to switch over to the recovery machine and finish filling the remaining Freon out of the recovery machine into the bus so that I don't leave the recovery machine full of Freon. So it's going to be the same process, but instead of putting the bottle onto this top line, I'm going to put the recovery machine onto the top line and put the Freon in through the machine. So here we'll attach the recovery machine to the stop service port we were just using. If you notice, the bottom port is still front seated there below the filter dryer. And then we'll go into the recovery machine settings in order to charge on the high side in our case, because we can't hook up a low side service line. So one thing that you'll notice with this machine, and I wanted to zoom in on this a little bit and go over it because it's kind of confusing, is when you go to charge, it's going to obviously complain that the vacuum level is not optimal because we already have Freon in the vehicle. We'll go through, we'll select our coach, we'll put the number in, just so we have a record of how much Freon we're adding. It's going to check the database, which this bus isn't in the database. But from here, you'll be able to select how many pounds of Freon you want to put in. And then it gives you the option of on the low side. You'll see over there on the right. And in our case, we don't want to fill in the low side because we only have a high side line hooked up. So because of this, you'll notice I have to put that special adapter on the bottom. On this particular bus, I could do this. The service adapter for the low side port, and I can hook up the low side adapter, as you can see here, and then I'll be able to fill the bus up from the low side. Unfortunately, the machine doesn't let you do the high and low at the same time unless the high side and the low side were under a vacuum already. So you could technically trick the machine by disconnecting the high side and low side line and pulling a vacuum with just the lines, put it into the charge state, select the high side charge process, and then hook the lines up to the bus then, and that would work. But you would have to be a little bit more creative. So one of the things I really don't like about the machine is that it doesn't give you that kind of flexibility to do really what you want to do. And you can see all of the liquid Freon going into the lines because the lines are actually jumping a little bit. And that's why it's another point to talk about is how dangerous this machine is. If I was back at the compressor right now, and I was attached to the compressor with the bus running like I am here, and I started filling with this, I could do some serious damage to the compressor. I'm also screwing in, a little technique is to screw in this service valve down here. I'm actually backseating it just a little bit to help some Freon flow through so that it doesn't all freeze up. Because if you see on the line there, it'll actually freeze up because the restriction is so great on the bottom when it's trying to pull in the remaining Freon. But you need to have that port almost front seated the entire way in order to make sure that the Freon comes out of the recovery machine and actually goes into the bus. Otherwise, we're on the high side and we're fighting against the pressure on the high side.
A few moments later. 2,000 years later. One eternity later.
So here we have charged that almost 16 pounds is what we're trying to put in the coach. The other interesting thing about this machine is that it will not let you charge more than 20 pounds at a time. So you have to do this in stages. So if you need to put, let's say, 25 pounds of Freon in, I first have to charge 20 pounds. When it completes that process, then I can go ahead and charge the remaining 5 pounds, which is also another limitation that I don't particularly like about the machine, since technically it has a 50-pound bottle on the machine, is more than capable of charging the full 31 pounds that this particular coach takes. Something else that may occur is charge stalled error, which tends to happen if the pressure on the vehicle side is not low enough for the machine to push Freon in. And so in our case, what we'll do here is we'll just front seat this valve that last 1 or 2 turns in. So we'll turn it in. It really didn't need very much here, you'll see. Once we front seat it in, essentially it will pull the pressure down much lower on the low side port. You'll start to see it drop down a little bit there, and then the Freon should start to flow back into the bus and do that last little bit. So you have to play around with the pressures a little bit here, but it's really important that those king valves work and you use them and make sure that they're working for future service. And then here at the very end, you'll see it gets close to 16 pounds, and then it will eventually stop, or it will reweigh the skid, or recheck the weight of the bottle before it finalizes and says everything's good to go. Once you've fully charged the coach up, now what we have to do now is I'm going to remove the service port, or remove the service line here on the bottom, the low side service line. I'm going to remove the high side service lines. I no longer need those attached. And then the next step is going to be to back seat this low service port king valve, which is going to take a lot of turns. We're going to turn it counterclockwise. We're going to essentially unthreading it, and you're going to see the little balls inside the receiver tank, especially the top one, will drop, because the liquid level now is starting to go through the line, through the filter dryer, and starting to circulate through the coach. Alright, well, I hope this video was informative to you all who are watching, and I want to take a few moments to go over a couple of things that we covered in the video and just recap what we went through. So the recovery machine, it's really important not to rely on the vacuum gauge in these recovery machines, because they're not an accurate indication of the vacuum level, as you saw in the video. The vacuum time does not equate to proper vacuum, so 10 minutes or 20 minutes or half an hour, none of that really means anything. You need to use a vacuum gauge to properly measure the vacuum levels and make sure that it's gotten down below 1,000 microns, or between 1,000 and 500. It's also important to check your vacuum gauge on the vacuum pump itself before using it on the vehicle, to make sure that it's actually working correctly, because sometimes they can get contaminated with oil and they don't register properly, and you'll waste a lot of time waiting to achieve a vacuum that you can't read anyways. The other thing to do is always work at the condenser when using these machines. Don't work at the compressor with them to recover and refill the entire coach. It may be necessary from time to time to work at just the compressor for a seal or some kind of a job, and in that case you can fill the system up from there, because it's usually only a pound or two. But I would wait at least 15 minutes before starting to coach up after refilling at the compressor, just to prevent any damage. Make sure your vacuum gauge doesn't get contaminated with oil and Freon, and in order to do that, it's important to keep the vacuum gauge higher than the connection that it's attached to. So if you have a small short hose, that's always helpful. 6-inch hose or 12-inch hose, vacuum hose, you can attach to it. and that'll raise the gauge up above the service port. If you install the vacuum gauge on a downward angle or below the service port, it can tend to get contaminated with oil, which can damage the gauge. And then in the end, always remember to back seat all of your valves when you're done servicing the coach. Back seating is fully counterclockwise on all of them. Mid-seated, as we discussed a little bit, was any few turns clockwise from the back-seated position is mid-seated to do service on the vehicle on that particular port. And front-seated we use when we want to cut off a hose or cut a compressor out of the situation or a condenser, so we can remove lines or check and make sure that certain parts of the system are properly evacuated or charged. And so with that, if you like this video, please subscribe and like the video, and we'll make more videos. The next video I hope to make is one on exactly why we use a vacuum gauge specifically and how they work and what can go wrong.